All right. Book of Esther. We're going to work our way from Esther chapter 2, verse 19 through chapter 3, verse 15 today. And this morning, you and I are going to be introduced to the villain of our story. We're going to be introduced to the central conflict in our story, and we're actually going to see things go from bad to worse to seemingly hopeless by the time we get done today. But I want to do something fun as we dive into this particular text this morning. So, the Jewish people celebrate a festival called Purim, which came about as a result of the story of Esther. And whenever the Jewish people read the story of Esther during the festival of Purim, they have some particular ways that they read it. Okay? One of those involves cheering every time the name of Mordecai is mentioned, and booing every time the name of Haman, the villain, is mentioned. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to read through this passage of Scripture before I dive into it. And I want you to cheer, and I want you to boo. Let's see how well we do, okay? Esther 2:19. Now when the virgins were gathered together the second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Now that was pretty weak. Okay? Esther had not made known her kindred or her people as Mordecai. Yay! Y'all have got to do that. As Mordecai had commanded her. For Esther obeyed Mordecai. Yay! There we go. Just as when she was brought up by him. In those days, as Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, became angry and sought to lay hands on the king. And this came to the knowledge of Mordecai. Yay! Very good. And he told it to Queen Esther, and Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. Yay! When the affair was investigated and found to be so, the men were both hanged on the gallows, and it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles of in the presence of the king. After these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, and advanced him and set his throne above all the officials who were with him. And all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman. For the king had so commanded concerning him, but Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage. Then the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, why do you transgress the king's command? And when they spoke to him day after day, and he would not listen to them, they told Haman, in order to see whether Mordecai, very good, would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. And when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage to him, Haman was filled with fury, but he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. So as they had made known to him the people of Mordecai, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews. The people of Mordecai throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. In the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast her, that is, lots, or what we would think of as dice, before Haman, day after day. And they cast it month after month until the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. Then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, there is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of every other people. And they do not keep the king's laws, so that it's not to the king's profit to tolerate them. If it please the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who have charge of the king's business, that they may put it into the king's treasuries. So the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. And the king said to Haman, the money is given to me, people also, to do with them as it seems good to you. Then the king's scribes were summoned in the 13th day of the first month, and an edict, according to all that Haman commanded, was written to the king's, there you go, to the king's satraps and to the governors over all the provinces and to the officials of all the peoples, to every province in its own script and every people in its own language. It was written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's signet ring. Letters were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with instruction to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder all their goods. A copy of the document was to be issued as a decree in every province by proclamation to all the peoples to be ready for that day. The couriers went out hurriedly by order of the king, and the decree was issued in Susa the citadel. And the king and Haman sat down to drink. But the city of Susa was thrown into confusion. Father, we just ask that you bless the reading and the hearing of your word. God, as we dive into this passage today, God, would you be gracious to us and grant us understanding? More than that, would you grant us wisdom to live in light of who you are, what you've done in Christ, and what you expect of your people. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So God is many things that you and I are not, right? Sovereign is one of those. Not only can God see the end of the story from the beginning, He is in complete control at every step along the way. We, on the other hand, can only ever see what's right in front of us. This means at times, from our vantage point, okay, it's going to look like God isn't sovereign and that evil has somehow gained the upper hand. More than that, it may actually feel like God doesn't love us when His hidden purposes seem to be running contrary to His promises. Because of this, you and I are often plagued as mortals, as human beings, with questions. Questions that the Bible surprisingly anticipates. Now, the Bible doesn't always answer it. But God is gracious, and He's kind, and He's compassionate. He stoops to our level. And He helps us to see that because of Jesus, God understands. And God wants to draw near, even when He doesn't necessarily always answer our questions. 3 of those big ones, I think we can easily work through as we walk through this section. Why do the enemies of God seem to prosper? Why does evil so often seem to get the upper hand? And why do I feel like God doesn't love me when I'm going through suffering? Look at how the passage starts. The passage starts with Mordecai, who at the time was an employee of the king. That's what it means for Mordecai to sit at the king's gate. It's essentially like our statement that the judge sits on the what? The bench. Exactly right. So Mordecai was serving in the administration of the Persian king. The king's gate would not be to us like a simple open and closed gate. It would have been a big building, about 130 feet long by 90 feet wide. It would have been supported by 4 massive columns. And on either side of this great big room, there would have been 2 side rectangular rooms. And throughout this king's gate, the business of the kingdom would have been conducted. And so Mordecai, day after day, finds himself there, perhaps it was because of Esther's influence that he gained a position in the kingdom, but he was some sort of government official. Well, here at the outset of this passage, it's potentially true that about 5 years have passed since Esther was crowned queen of Persia. And Mordecai has been working, and he just so happens one day to hear that there's a plot against the king's life. Mordecai wisely then goes to Esther, tells Esther about the plot against the queen. The queen tells it to the king. It's found out to be true, and the two men are hanged on the gallows. Now, the idea of the gallows is going to come up again in the book of Esther. I just want you to know, it's not a rope as we would typically think of a gallows. In ancient Persia, the gallows would have been essentially a long, tall post with a pointy end on it, and people would have been impaled on it. And they would have been just left there to hang publicly as the birds picked away at their flesh. Okay? It's a reminder that you don't cross the king. Right? That's what happened to these two guys who were found out to be treasonous. Now, the fascinating thing about this particular text, and remember, there were no verse divisions, no chapter divisions when these things were originally written. So in chapter 3, verse 1, when it says, after these things, King Ahasuerus promoted. Now, whose name should we expect to find in there? Mordecai. Why? Because Mordecai had performed this incredibly good deed on behalf of the king, and historically the Persian kings were very, very, very good about rewarding those who were loyal to them. They believed that's how you keep people loyal to you, by treating them well. So when we read here at the beginning of chapter 3 that it wasn't Mordecai, but it was Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, who is promoted to second in command in the kingdom of Persia, it actually sounds an ominous note in the text. Like we're about to enter a dark chapter of the story. Now, why is that? Okay? I want to give you a little context. The writer of Esther tells us that Haman was an Agagite, which means he's a descendant of Agag the Amalekite. When Israel first came out of Egypt, the Amalekites attacked them in the wilderness and tried to destroy them. Right? You can find that in Exodus chapter 17, verses 8 through 16. As a result of that, God cursed the Amalekites and ordered that their memory be blotted from the face of the earth. You can find that in Deuteronomy 25, verses 17 through 19. Later, when Saul became king of Israel, in fact, Israel's first king, he was ordered to carry out that sentence on the Amalekites and on King Agag in particular. However, as some of you probably know, Saul disobeyed the Lord. Saul spared the life of King Agag, and Saul took some of the best possessions of the Amalekites for his very own, thinking that he had done so on behalf of the Lord. But that's not what the Lord told him to do. So he disobeyed. And eventually, of course, he was no longer king of Israel. Ever after that moment, there was a bitter rivalry between the Amalekites and the Israelites. Consequently, as I said, the promotion of Haman, the Agagite, to the second most powerful position in the empire, it strikes a dark chord in the story. In fact, the ancestry of Mordecai actually heightens the tension. Go all the way back to the beginning of chapter 2 of Esther, verse 5. Now, there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai. Now, in Hebrew literature, the way that a character is identified when we first meet them is incredibly important. So the fact that Mordecai is a Jew is vitally important for where this story is going. The text also tells us his lineage. He's the son of Jair, son of Shimi, son of Kish, of Benjamin. Do you know what tribe King Saul was from?
Benjamin.
The tribe of Benjamin. So Mordecai is a descendant of King Saul. Mordecai, in the bigger picture, is also a Jew. So this conflict that's going to erupt between Mordecai and between Haman is much more than a personal. It's essentially a cosmic thing between the God of all creation, the God who's made a covenant with his people, and the powers of darkness who want to wipe them from the face of the earth. Right? So that's what we're going to see, and that's where we're going. But right off the bat, you and I see an injustice. You and I see that Haman receives a promotion that should have gone to Mordecai. And so we're left with a question, right? Like a question that the psalmist in Psalm 73 takes up. Why in the world does it seem like that the wicked prosper and those who have been chosen by God, his very own people, seem to suffer? Have you ever wrestled with that question before? I have. The psalmist has. Turn to Psalm 73 for just a minute. Psalm 73. Psalm 73, verse 2. But as for me, my feet had almost stumbled. My steps had nearly slipped. For I was envious of the arrogant when I saw the prosperity of the wicked. For they have no pangs until death. Their bodies are fat and sleek. They are not in trouble as others are. They are not stricken like the rest of mankind. Therefore pride is their necklace. Violence covers them as a garment. Their eyes swell out through fatness. Their hearts overflow with follies. They scoff and speak with malice. Loftily they threaten oppressions. They set their mouths against the heavens, and their tongues struts through the earth. Now, this is a perfect description of Haman's character. Haman is a proud individual. In fact, probably one of the proudest individuals in the entire Bible. Doesn't like it when he crosses paths with Mordecai. The psalmist, in fact, wrestles through this fact that it seems like the proud are the ones with all the power. They're the ones who advance. They're the ones who go and collect $200 time and time and time again. And yet the righteous suffer setback after setback after setback. In fact, it hit the psalmist so hard that in verse 13 he confesses this. All in vain have I kept my heart clean and washed my hands in innocence. For all the day long I have been stricken and rebuked every morning. You know what the psalmist was wrestling through? He was wrestling through the fact that I've chosen to follow God. I've given my life to God. And all of these people seem to be having much better lives than me, going about all their own business and doing their own thing. I've messed up. I've chosen the wrong life. I've chosen the wrong path. But as he works his way through these struggles, I want you to notice it. He comes to a point in verse 16 when he says, but when I thought how to understand this, it seemed to me a wearisome task. Until I went into the sanctuary of God, then I discerned their end. You see, it's really important that you and I understand that we only know part of the story. Only God sees the end from the beginning. Only God knows how everything's going to wrap up and play out at the very end of this story. Now the good news is you and I are going to see Haman rise and then what? Fall by the time we get to the end of Esther. And it's there. It's designed to show us, to picture for us the truths of Psalm 73. That to be part of God's company, of his people, is much better in the end than to be the one who seems to prosper now, but in the end will be humbled. Right? Like so many times in the biblical text, we're shown the proud and the powerful. But we're also shown that they're not really that powerful or important after all. So many times we're told that God will exalt the humble and humble the exalted. Proverbs 29:23, one's pride will bring him low, but he who is lowly in spirit will obtain honor. Matthew 23:12, whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. James 4:6, but he gives more grace. Therefore it says, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. So whenever you and I wrestle with those questions, right? Like, why do the wicked seem to prosper? We've got to hold tightly to the fact that we may not see everything, but God does. And at the end of the story, when he wraps everything up, we're going to be able to look back as his people and see why it seemed like those things were happening. But we still wrestle with those questions. We also wrestle with this question, why does evil so often seem to have the upper hand? Remember I said things go from bad, right? Like the fact that Mordecai was not recognized for his good act on behalf of the king, but they eventually go to worse, right? Verse 2, and all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage. Then the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, why do you transgress the king's command? And when they spoke to him day after day and he would not listen to them, they told him in order to see whether Mordecai's words would stand. So apparently, day after day, Haman would make his way through this large entrance hall into the palace complex. And because of the king's command, everyone within the king's gate was required to bow down and acknowledge Haman just as they would have acknowledged the presence of the king. And everybody did it, but one man. Mordecai. Yeah. Now the way that you and I have to picture it, Mordecai probably stood in the back of the room. Mordecai did not want to be singled out. Mordecai did not necessarily want to be noticed. He did not necessarily want to cause a scene. All of this was not meant to draw attention to himself, okay? He was simply being faithful to the convictions of his heart. But other servants notice that he's not bowing, and day after day they come to him and they say, Mordecai, man, what's going on? Now, interestingly, Mordecai had hidden his identity as a Jew too. Okay? There's indications in this text that Mordecai had compromised in ways just like Esther had done. But Mordecai gets to this point in his life where he goes, look, I've gone this far, but I can't go any further. I can't do that. And so finally they pester him enough to where he says, look guys, here's the deal. I'm a Jew. We bow down before only one. Right? That's it. And so they go back to Haman. And it's like they're going back to Haman on Mordecai's behalf, maybe to get him something of a religious exemption. Right? But that's not what happens. Haman becomes so furious with Mordecai when he finds out not only that Mordecai will not bow, but that Mordecai is a Jew. That this age-old conflict erupts again, and through Haman, the prince of darkness, basically intends once again, not just to make Mordecai pay, but to make all the people of God pay. Now, can y'all imagine the fury, the anger, the hatred boiling over inside the kind of person who feels so disrespected that he's going to wipe out their entire race because of what one person did to you? And here's what you and I have to remember. The characters in the book of Esther had no idea at this point in the story, as these things unfold, that God was going to deliver them from certain destruction when Haman gets his way and this edict for the annihilation of the Jews is issued. At the end of this chapter, they were rightly disturbed, rightly distressed, rightly thrown into confusion, just as we are when we encounter the kind of evil for which there is no explanation. You see, the kind of evil that's that's going to unfold in this chapter. The kind of evil that exists in our own world today. In the very middle of the story, it doesn't make sense. That's why we kind of have to camp out here before we see things begin to turn around. Because it's not until you and I see the whole story as God does that we can see that God does have purposes for evil, even when those purposes are sometimes hard to understand. But that doesn't mean real evil does not exist. It does just as much today as it did then. This would not be the last time the Jewish people would face extermination. Folks, we've seen it within the last 100 years. 6 million were killed just because they were Jews. How many millions in our own culture, little ones, unborn ones, have been the objects of a genocide that goes unnoticed? It's pretty sobering. And it's pretty real. And we kind of enter into the story to kind of feel the weight of it. And to recognize that we really don't know where these things are going to take us. We don't know where these things are going to go. We don't necessarily know what the end result of some of these atrocities in our world is going to be. And though we may not always know why, here are some things we can say, okay? Number one, God did not exempt himself from the effects of evil. Jesus came, and Jesus endured the full fury of the evil of mankind. And the most innocent person who ever lived endured the most horrible treatment that sinners could throw at him. And so he knows what it is to be betrayed. He knows what it is to be attacked. He knows what it is to suffer and to suffer deeply. Number two, God, in fact, through Jesus and through the cross, worked through the greatest of all evils to accomplish the greatest of all goods. Which means that if God can do that, then we have to see everything else in light of the cross, and we have to hold on to the fact that God can take anything, no matter how ugly, how horrific, how devastating, how tragic, and God can do good for his people through that battle. It's one of the things that the book of Esther teaches us. Romans 8 reminds us of this truth when we hear in Romans 8:28 through 30 that God will work all things for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. Bottom line, when you and I are faced with that question, why does evil seem to so often get the upper hand? You and I have to remember the cross. You see, there it seemed like evil had the upper hand, but behind the scenes, God was accomplishing the greatest victory through the greatest evil in the history of humankind. And it's the cross, as one author says, that assures you and me that no matter how bad things look, God is still working. God is still working even when we can't see it. The cross assures us that God is with us even when we can't feel it. The cross assures us that God's redemptive purposes are greater than the evil being done. And the evil done in this passage, the evil planned and prepared for in this passage, is evil indeed. Verse 6 says, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews. All of them. And if that weren't the best way to say it, at the end of the passage in verse 13, so that the author knows we're clear, the edict went out with instructions to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all the Jews. terms there piled up in succession to help us understand how dire the situation was. And there was so much coldness and cruelty that the end of the passage says that once the edict went out, the king and Haman sat down to do what? Have a drink. Whoo! Oh, that's brutal. What's worse is the king didn't even know who he was he didn't even know the people he was signing the death warrant for. Notice how Haman manipulated him. Haman manipulated him by not telling him who the people were. He didn't mention that they were Jews. Haman manipulated him by saying, hey, it's in your best interests to do this. Haman manipulated by offering him an exorbitant sum of money. How much does it say? 10,000 talents. Do you know that that was 2/3 of the entire year's revenue of the entire empire? An amount that Haman could have never given him. But the king doesn't seem to care. In fact, the king says, you can keep your money. You can do with those people whatever you want to. Why? Because remember, these uprisings have been happening in the kingdom, and he's already paranoid. So Haman's whispering in his ear like worm tail. In the Lord of the Rings, right? Worm tongue. Worm tail is another story. So, profound evil that causes us to question God's sovereignty and His goodness. But here's the thing. In the face of profound suffering, you and I tend to ask really a more personal and more primary question. Does God still love me? Now I want you to notice something about this text. Go to verse 12. Then the king's scribes were summoned on the 13th day of the first month. And an edict, according to all that Haman commanded, was written to the king's satraps and governors all over the provinces and to the officials of all the peoples. All right? The 13th day of the month of Nisan is the day before Passover. So this edict was drawn up on the day before Passover. It went out and was presumably received by the people of God all over the empire in the days surrounding Passover. Y'all, the fact that the decree for their annihilation was issued on that day, it probably seemed like a cruel joke and something of an irony, adding insult to injury among the people of God. And it brings up this primary question that Esther deals with. Would God still be true to His covenant promises to His people, even though they had been exiled from the promised land for breaking their covenant promises to Him? Let's just translate that and simplify it. Did God still love them? And would He come through for them? That's it. And I'm willing to bet this morning that when you and I push past all the intellectual questions, why do the wicked prosper? And why does evil so often seem to have the upper hand? In the midst of suffering, no matter what kind of suffering it is, when you push past all the intellectual stuff, the real question you and I have is this. Does God really love me? Will God really come through for me? That's the question. And I would venture to say, many of you have felt like that. Many of you have felt the tension of that question. Have you ever experienced a season of suffering so painful that you wondered, and here's the deal, I mean, really wondered, really wrestled with the fact that, does God still love me? I have to imagine that the Jews entered into a period of deep pain and spiritual agony as they awaited their coming destruction. In fact, chapter 4, verse 1 says as much. When Mordecai learned all that had been done, he tore his clothes and he put on sackcloth and ashes and went out into the midst of the city, and he cried out with a loud and bitter cry. He didn't care who saw him. He didn't care who heard him. Y'all, this was deep spiritual pain and agony. This was suffering on a level that this man may have never experienced in his whole life. Now, you and I know how the story ends. And that's a help. It anchors us as we walk through the valley of chapter 3. But the question is, how do you and I anchor ourselves in our own periods of profound suffering where and when we don't quite exactly know how things are going to turn out? Sometimes people don't get better. Right? Right? Sometimes marriages aren't put back together. Right? Sometimes that job you just got, you end up without it. And you didn't expect it. Sometimes that child never comes home. That child never repents. Sometimes you outlive that child. Right? Profound and powerful suffering happens to us. And we don't always know how things are going to turn out. And sometimes the endings are hard. The question is, how do we anchor our souls when the waves of suffering seem so large and so powerful that you and I don't know how we're going to be able to hold on? Wrap around our ankles and wrap around our arms and wrap around our bodies when those waves come. The first one is this. If you and I don't have anything else, we have Christ. Amen. Go back to Psalm 73 for just a second. Psalm 73, verse 23. Notice what the psalmist says after he's wrestled through this whole idea that the wicked continually prosper. He says, nevertheless, I am continually with you. You hold my right hand. You guide me with your counsel. And afterward, you will receive me to glory.
Amen.
Isn't that awesome?
It is.
Jesus told his disciples, don't worry. When I go away, I'll send another who's just like me. And he'll not only be with you, he will dwell in you. And guess what? Where I'm going, you'll get to be also. Because I'll come back and I'll receive you to myself. So the psalmist reminds us that in the face of profound suffering, in the face of questions that honestly we can't always answer, we need to know that if we don't get the answers, we have Jesus. And he is with us. He will give us his counsel. He will walk with us. I love this. You hold my right hand. Y'all, sometimes, we're all adults, right? But sometimes I just need Jesus to hold my hand.
Amen.
Don't you? And then the psalmist says, not only will you have me here, but afterward, you'll receive me into glory. Y'all, this is as bad as it gets for those who know Jesus. And death's not the end of the road, it's just a doorway. It's just a doorway into the very presence of Christ. The Bible also reminds us that there's ultimately a new creation coming too. God's going to take all the pain, the death, the sin, the wickedness, and the evil. And he's going to burn it all up. And he's going to transform this world. And heaven and earth are going to meet. And he's going to dwell in eternity with us, his people, in a perfect world where there are no such things. And when you and I get there, he's going to wipe away every tear. It's what John promises in Revelation. Romans 8 is one of those key passages in the Bible. It's an anchor point for us. And it also reminds us that we have the Spirit through whom we can cry out to the Father as children in the midst of our suffering. It reminds us that our suffering, brothers and sisters, is not punishment. The things that you and I suffer as God's children is not punishment, for there is now no what? Condemnation for those who are in Christ. Now the Father disciplines us. He disciplines us because He loves us and wants to form us and shape us into the image of Jesus. But it's always out of His good heart to do that He disciplines us. Not out of His desire to harm us. Romans 8 reminds us too, as I've said earlier, that God is working all things together for the good of those who love Him and are called according to His purpose. Romans 8, that wonderful, amazing, kind of mountaintop chapter. It tells us that chapter 3 isn't the end of Esther's story. Mordecai's story. Haman's story. Or the end of the line for the Jewish people. It reminds us that no matter how things go or how bad they get, God is always working for the good of His people and His glory. In fact, it's Romans 8. When I lay it over this passage in Esther, it reminds me to ask different questions. Questions like these. Could it be that God has plans that include Mordecai's good deed being overlooked by the king? Yeah. You're going to see those unfold. Could it be that God has plans that require Haman being elevated to the second place in the kingdom? Yes. You're going to see those unfold. Could it be that Haman's casting of lots, thinking that his gods would tell him when to best execute his plan against the Jews, could it be that all the while God was the one actually controlling the throw of the dice? Do you think God's sovereignty extends to things that small? Absolutely. Write down Proverbs 16:33. Proverbs 16:33 essentially says, and I'm going to paraphrase it for you, even the roll of the dice is in the hands of the Lord. Could it be that God intends to demonstrate His power over this proud king and his kingdom? Isn't that exactly what He did when He first rescued His people from Egypt? Could it be that He wanted to remind His wayward people of His steadfast love, a love that was and is solely dependent on His gracious character? Whenever you and I face seasons of deep, dark, profound suffering, we always have to go back to a passage like Romans 8 and anchor ourselves. We have to anchor ourselves in the sovereignty of God, anchor ourselves in the love of God, anchor ourselves in the presence of the Spirit of God, anchor ourselves in the promises of Christ to be with us and never forsake us and to take us home to glory when this life is done. It's the only way you and I are going to make it. And I pray God's grace upon you and us, and that God would indeed anchor us in those ways. Let's pray. Father.